Tonight we're fortunate to have with us a distinguished panel of experts in the field of disability issues. We will present to you a variety of insights and points of view regarding these issues. And hopefully you will leave this evening, if not newly informed, then questioning. When I was asked to moderate this panel, I was told to really keep things rolling. It's a role for which I'm aptly qualified. Before I introduce our featured panelists, I would like to say a few words about Project Inclusion in our continuing series of discussions. The organization began this year as an ad hoc committee working with Dean Graham Allison and his staff to promote awareness of disability-related issues and their implications in developing policy, to encourage the development of public policy in these areas, and to serve as a resource and advocate within the school, the university, and the wider community. The community or institution which fails to include all its people in the pool of its social resources is no less disabled than an individual who is challenged by reduced eyesight, by reduced mobility, by speech, mental, or other impairments. It's important for those of us who are educated here by this institution to have an exposure to those issues, which will inevitably be a part of our professional as well as our personal lives. It's my pleasure to play a part in the establishment of Project Inclusion and of the concept within this community. And I'd like to begin our program by introducing our first speaker, Ted Kennedy, Jr. Ted is a graduate of Wesleyan University and is the executive director of Facing the Challenge Incorporated, which he founded in 1985 as a nonprofit office dedicated to the awareness and elimination of barriers facing the physically and mentally challenged. He has spent the past few years striving to change social policies that discriminate against people with disabilities. In 1984, he addressed the National Democratic Convention on the need to reshape policy and understanding that will advance the independent living movement. He has testified before Congress in favor of ratification of the Civil Rights Act to include people with disabilities. In addition to his disability-related advocacy role, some of his accomplishments include serving as special correspondent to the Boston Globe to cover the Philippine elections in Manila, and spearheading statewide fundraising drives to provide relief in Ethiopia and the Sudan, and serving as campaign manager for the re-election of his father, Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real honor for me to appear here, and it's also an honor for me to appear with a really distinguished group. I think one of the things that we're trying to do tonight is to raise some issues in the Harvard community and indeed in the community as a whole. And so I didn't really come here this evening to lecture, and I hope that following my remarks, I hope that we can have an open, frank discussion of some of these issues. But I'd just like to there's 3 points that I'd basically like to underscore this evening, is that people with disabilities should be considered a minority group in our country. And I think that that's important for our own consciousness, and I think it's until we are recognized as a minority group, much like blacks and Hispanics and other people who've been left out of our society, I think only then can we attain our full place and rightful citizenship in our country. Secondly is the need to dismantle policies which perpetuate dependency and perpetuate segregation. There are so many historic imbalances which exist in our country. Those historic imbalances have moved contrary to the women's movement and moved against blacks in our country. We face some of the same things. We're not asking for anything. We need to be provided with opportunities, but more than I hate even to say the word provide, because that in turn sounds like that we want something, that we need something. The fact is that what we really need is to dismantle past imbalances. And I think, most importantly, I think we need to work as a group together. Here, tonight we have individuals representing a number of different disabilities. And, I think and the important thing that we need to do for our own selves is to work together and to really frame our causes together. There are a lot of issues that we do have a lot of separate needs and a lot of different issues, but I think until we can frame ourselves and work together, I don't feel that we're going to make any progress in our civil rights movement. So just to frame it, I think, we've got goals and dreams just like everybody else. But unfortunately, to have a disability in this society is to be unemployed. You're not expected to go to school. You're not expected to work. You're not expected to even have a family. And I think that these are some of the issues that I hope that we can get into tonight, because I think they're very important. But my contention is this evening that it's not a physical or mental condition that constitutes the greatest, quote, handicap in society, but rather it's society itself and the outdated policies and practices which keep people out and keep people back. Like the blacks in the 1950s, people are still educated in separate schools. People still can't get into restaurants. And when you see a set of stairs here at Harvard and around Boston, it's just like, if you have a mobility impairment, it's like a sign saying whites only. And I think if there's anything that I can leave you with this evening, it's that this is the same type of civil rights struggle that has gone before. I don't pretend to or purport to speak on behalf of everyone with a disability. Tonight you're going to hear a lot of different points of view, and it's no wonder. We come from all different kinds of background, socioeconomic, rich and poor, black and white. But I think some of the things that really tie us together are a history of misunderstanding and fear and segregation, and we have a common social history, and we have common goals of acceptance and dignity, and I think so. I would contend that really it's the things that they're greater things that really bring us together that really separate us apart. Before we really kind of get in to these issues, I think it's important for people to understand about where the movement has really come from. Because I think our history, the history of people with disabilities, can really be characterized in two words: isolation and segregation. And many things have happened in the last 10 years that really have genuinely and generally improved the lives of people with disabilities. But traditionally, people have been set apart. They've been warehoused. We've been isolated in the past. And, there's just generally been a state of repression. And it's out of this repression, and it's out of this segregation, that our whole rights movement began. And it's no wonder that people have the myths and stereotypes that people, have today. People are afraid of people with disabilities. They fear people. They feel that people can't take care of themselves. As I said, you're not expected to get a job. There are all these different notions and myths that people have. And that is because simply people have not been a visible and viable part in the community. And that has changed. And I think just the fact that we're having a forum here this evening has changed. So the fact that people have been isolated, people have been, that has fostered these myths. But, lately, society, the movement as it took place, slowly things started to change. And society started to say that maybe we shouldn't isolate and protect people and take care of them. That maybe, that people deserve to become a part, and people can contribute, and people can be creative, and people can, have a say in the affairs of the community. A lot has changed. We had a Section 504, which is a civil rights law. But we've got a long way to go. For instance, right now in the State House here in Boston, we're trying to increase affordable, accessible housing by 5%. If you have a mobility impairment and you live and work in Boston, there's no place for you to live. And hopefully housing. We're going to hear a long roster of different issues, but it's basically bread and butter issues that we're talking about. Housing, education, transportation, all which are interrelated. My talk right now is just simply to try to set the stage about, who are disabled people. If you have a disability, you're twice as likely to fall below the federal poverty line. You're twice as likely to be illiterate. 65% of people who are able and willing to work can't get a job. That is a tremendous fact. And those that do get work earn less. 40%, if you're a white disabled male, you earn 40% on the average less than your able-bodied counterpart. 88% less if you're black and have a disability. And the high cost of health care is just, compounds the problem. The fact is, this issue affects us all. It's not just people with disabilities that are affected. When you have a country spending $1 out of every $12 that go into some kind of social welfare program for people with disabilities, that's not just my taxpayers' money. It's all of our tax money being used essentially to subsidize discrimination in our society. So it affects all of us. Billions and billions of dollars are being used to keep people in a dependent situation. That has got to stop, and I look forward to talking about that. So there's a lot that we can do here. I know that there's a lot of people who want to elaborate and speak on some issues that concern them. So I'll wrap things up now, but I think it's, as I said, there's a lot of different areas that we need to be looking at. Just to mention one, the increasing senior population. Because people are living longer, because of modern medicine, it's bad enough the way we treat our seniors now. What's going to happen in another 10 or 20 years when we have twice as many senior citizens? What are we going to do with them? They're not going to be able to ride on accessible public transportation. You can't get into a restaurant. These are issues that are eventually going to affect us all. And I think I think it's important to raise them. So in short, I would contend that until we can move anywhere, we've got to be able to work together. And secondly, we need to recognize our issues as fundamental civil rights ones. And thirdly, I think it's important to dismantle the policies. And a lot of them are architectural, but many of them are attitudinal as well. And I hope we have the chance to discuss those this evening as well. Thank you.
Chapel. John is Deputy Commissioner for Independent Living and Consumer Involvement for the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission. He manages a budget of over $20 million annually in independent living-related programs and is a liaison with independent living centers throughout Massachusetts. Prior to working for the Commission, he was Executive Director of the Independence Center, an independent living center in Hampton Roads, Virginia, for several years. He has been an electronics engineer for the federal government and has a degree in that field from the Florida Institute of Technology. This past summer, he participated in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Management Development Program here at Kennedy School. He is a nationally recognized expert in the area of disability, accessibility, and on issues of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of '73 relating to non-discrimination of disabled citizens. John?
Thank you. It's my challenge tonight to speak to you a few minutes about leadership. I thought I better mention something. Ted mentioned about you're not expected to have a family if you have a disability. I better be sure and tell my wife that when I get home. Actually, I've been on the road for a couple of days, and I got to experience the thrill and of victory and the agony of defeat riding Eastern Airlines back from Washington, D.C. tonight, and I almost did not make it. I caught the 4:30 flight that left at 6 o'clock, and then the 5:30 flight actually, I think, beat us out of the stops. So I was sitting there on the aircraft next to an interesting gentleman discussing venture capitalism, and then we got into discussing disability, which I do wherever I go. But anyway, my challenge tonight is to talk to you about leadership and people with disabilities. And my first question is, do you think of people who have disabilities in leadership roles? I mean, think about it for a minute. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see a person with an obvious disability? Is it sympathy? Is it empathy? Is it, oh, for the grace of God be I? I dare say it's not leadership. The point I'm trying to make, and I want to talk to you about tonight, is we have to have some basic attitudinal changes in this country before people such as those of us on the panel tonight can really attain the potential of our abilities. Now, it's interesting that I was kind of introduced as an expert on disability, and I really appreciate that, and I'm flattered by that. But I think it's interesting that how many other people with disabilities are recognized nationally for fields that are not in disability. And yet there's a strange paradox, because we have many of our leaders who in our history have had disabilities. The obvious ones come to mind very quickly. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man for which the school was named after, Jack Kennedy, had a chronic, severe back condition that was very, very painful for many, many years, and in fact, many times limited his mobility. George Washington had some very severe problems with his teeth, and of course, as we all know, wore wooden false teeth, but it was a very difficult problem for him, especially in his later life. But the thing is, we've never had to deal with the fact that they had disabilities. Somehow, they were able to transcend the label of that disability. And I'm saying we've got to somehow convince people that, and we have a responsibility ourselves to do that too, I might add, to convince people that our disability is not a limiting fact in our lives. And there are many reasons why I think these things come to mind, the things that I mentioned, the issues of sympathy, the issues of that poor person with a disability. It's because of the mindset of our community. It's because we are seen usually in paternalistic roles. We are seen in helpless situations. The images that are portrayed for us, for the most part, with the exception of those very wonderful people who, in spite of their disability, have overcome outstanding odds that have made it. Seriously, except for those few role models that we supposedly have in the media, most of us are not seen in that way. That's why Ted's statistics about 40% underemployment if you're a white male. By the way, for women, the statistics are even worse. If you're a white or a black woman with a disability, you're much, much even worse off than those other statistics. But the point is that we have got to create an equal society before we can truly begin to express our equal opportunity. I'm not sure I'm interested in political life. I'm not sure that I'd be interested in running for Congress. But if I were interested, would my disability be a hindrance to society? My answer to you is that probably it would be difficult. However, there has recently in the past, there was a senator from North Carolina named John East who used a wheelchair. But let me tell you something about John East. When John East ran for Senate, he was never photographed one time in a wheelchair. And John East, in all of his TV commercials, it was never clear that he had a disability. When John East ran, most people in North Carolina did not know he had a disability. And in fact, until he was about to come to D.C. and they had to make major modifications in the Senate, most people did not know that John East was a disability. Now, notwithstanding the party affiliation that John East was with, and the fact that I don't think he was very sensitive to disability at all, the fact is that he knew, and his marketers knew, that his disability would be a hindrance to him, and him trying to express leadership capabilities. And that's my point. The point is that John East, whether you like his politics or not, was otherwise qualified to be a senator in the United States Congress. But he had to hide his disability. How many other people can you think of in this country who are presidents of the Fortune 500 who have disabilities? How many people in major leadership roles in this country that you think of, that you can think of who have a disability? That's my point. We have not yet begun to break the back of discrimination that Ted talked about and really getting opportunities to begin to express our capabilities. As I mentioned, I was on the plane tonight discussing venture capital with this gentleman next to me, and he was talking to me about New York City and the fact that in spite of the rich resources that New York City has, that it really hasn't done a lot for exemplary programs for people with disabilities and education and other kinds of issues. I pointed out to him that New York is not unique. That in fact, in most cities, major cities in this country, overt discrimination still occurs for people with disabilities. One interesting thing that New York has done, by the way, is that their bus system is now completely accessible. I can ride the city bus anywhere I want to in New York City. I can't do that in Boston. And in fact, there are probably only 4 major metropolitan areas in the country where I can get on mass transit and expect to go from one place to another. Seattle, Denver, to some extent Chicago and New York. And and San Diego also has some accessible systems. But the point is, if you can't even go somewhere, how in the world do you expect to ever be able to hold a job down and improve yourself? I may be jumbling up a little bit the issues that I'm trying to make to you. But what I'm trying to show you is that the issues are so complicated that until we break the back of this stereotype and then really cross the barriers of overt discrimination, people with disabilities are not going to be able to express leadership positions, are not going to have the opportunities to really get into leadership positions, and are not going to be able to really have the kinds of equal opportunity that we're talking about. Let me just close by saying that my experience here at Harvard last summer was very exciting. I enjoyed the Kennedy School program for senior executives. And I think for the most part, the staff did an excellent job of facilitating my attendance here. But I'm sure that if I compared notes with my compatriot here on my left and discussed the accessibility of this building, we could share a lot of common war stories. That if we talked about how many times each morning I pulled up out here and found somebody abusing a handicapped parking place, like tonight. I'm parked on the hill. I almost killed myself getting out of my car. I mean, if I can't even come to the school whose namesake is probably the single most important individual in our country in terms of equal rights for people, if the building can't be assembled for equality, we have a long way to go. And I think that we need to think about those kind of fundamental issues, because it's clear in my mind that discrimination, in whatever form it takes, is still racist. And in closing, as Martin Luther King said, no people are free until all people are free. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Mark Maurer. Mark is the president of the National Federation of the Blind, a post which he has held since July of 1986. Prior to that, he was a general counsel for that organization. Mark earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. He earned his Juris Doctorate degree from Indiana University. He's a lawyer by trade and owns his own law firm. For a time, he worked in the Office of the General Counsel of the Civil Aeronautics Board, and for several years also held a post and was very active in a public interest law firm in Toledo, Ohio. Mark?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I appreciate the opportunity to come here tonight and to be a part of this panel. The blind, the halt, and the lame have traditionally been objects of pity and charity. This has meant a certain degree of kindness, but the generosity has always been a mixed blessing. In physics, it is said that for any action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In social affairs, the same concept applies. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Those who receive charity are obliged to pay for it. One of the greatest problems faced by the blind today is that we are the objects of charity. The society at large feels that it will be called upon to give something to the blind. There is no law which requires equal treatment for the sighted. Such a law is unnecessary. However, there is a law which demands that the handicapped shall not be subjected to discrimination, at least part of the time. This law is mostly ineffective. The general public is expected to give equality to a class of persons which it regards as not being entitled to it. How do we pay for charity? What can be offered in return for the gifts we receive? How are the scales balanced? What is taken from the blind, or for that matter from others, in order to reach equilibrium? To answer this question, contrast the position in our culture maintained by the local banker or entrepreneur with that customarily associated with the blind. As I said before, non-discrimination laws apply to the blind. They don't apply to the banker. Reasonable accommodation is required for the blind. It is not for the banker. Charitable fund drives are conducted for the blind. It is inconceivable that they would be for the banker. Generosity and pity are felt for the blind. The banker gets something else. For the banker, there is sometimes a little envy, occasionally a touch of fear, and almost always a substantial measure of respect. The reason for the difference is that the banker has something that most people in society want. The blind are not regarded in the same way. What pays for the charity? For a large segment of the population, the income tax deduction is insufficient to induce a gift. Instead, there has to be another reason. Charity salves the conscience. It is a tangible reminder for those who have done something they regard as less than good, that their lives are not without redeeming features. But there is something even more powerful than the need to compensate for past misdeeds. It is the wish to feel secure in the knowledge that the donor is helping those less fortunate. This, of course, may be restated. If I may regard you as an object of pity and charity, I am in a position superior to yours. Therefore, if I make a gift from charitable motives, I am necessarily superior to you. The blind and handicapped pay for the charity. The gift necessarily connotes inequality. This means that one of the most serious problems faced by the blind today and by the handicapped is that we are the objects of charity. If we permit these circumstances to continue, we give tacit consent to the two-class system. In a relatively free society, when two parties transact business, one sets the price and the other determines the quantity. It never happens that one party decides both price and quantity. If the buyer says that 50 items are required, the seller will establish the price. If the seller indicates that the price for a specific commodity will be $100, the purchaser will determine the number to be bought. The number may be 0 or some quantity higher than that. If, on the other hand, the purchaser says that the price of the commodity will be not $100 but $50, the seller may decide to take the merchandise and go home. In other words, the quantity may be 0. The blind, just like others, have always needed certain basic commodities. Food, shelter, and clothing are essential. Governmental institutions, charitable organizations, or benevolent individuals provided these necessaries. But price and quantity are never controlled by the same party. The blind demanded a certain quantity. Those who made the gifts controlled the price. Only when blind people began to have sufficient resources to meet basic needs did these circumstances begin to change. If a group of individuals within society never has the opportunity to choose whether it will determine price or quantity, it lacks the essentials for freedom. Until fairly recently, the blind have been in this position. Blind people determined quantity and someone else set the price. Because blind people were not regarded as having any trading stock, goods or services that could be sold, payment had to be made in other coin, and the price was always high. Blacks in America constitute a minority. As this group began to move from second-class status to full equality, it faced almost the same economic circumstances that now confront the blind. But there is one significant difference. Blacks were regarded as having the capacity for manual labor. The blind are ordinarily not considered suitable to perform the ordinary job in the ordinary place of business. Therefore, in the effort to become a fully integrated part of our society, blind people are at a greater disadvantage than blacks have ever been. This is true despite the absence of blind slavery. The difference is that the blind are thought of as having nothing to offer. Not only are the skills and talents possessed by the blind not sought in the job market, but often those who volunteer to give their time without cost find their offers rejected. In the minds of many, the final summation for blindness is nothing to sell and nothing that will be accepted as a gift, complete worthlessness. Of course, this understanding of blindness is completely false. The blind represent a cross-section of the general population. All of the talent and all of the virtue that can be found among ordinary human beings is possessed by the blind. All of the abilities that others possess, except the ability to see, are possessed by the blind. Blind people I know are as bright, as energetic, as willing to give without counting the cost, as anxious to do a good job, and as trustworthy as anyone I have ever met. They are also as dull, as boring, as willing to take without giving, and as lazy as any other group on the planet. In other words, blind people have all of the characteristics of the general population, except one, sight. The problem is that blindness has been regarded as the only meaningful attribute. After it has become clear that the individual in question is blind, nothing else matters. In the minds of many, this one factor is the final summation. Do I state the case too strongly? Recently, a blind man in St. Louis, Missouri, approached the ticket counter in a Trailways bus depot. He wanted to buy a full-fare bus ticket. The ticket agent told him that he must produce a doctor's certificate because this was necessary for a handy fare ticket. A handy fare ticket costs less than the ordinary bus ticket. The blind man, a member of the National Federation of the Blind, responded that a handy fare ticket was not needed. He wanted to pay full fare for an ordinary ticket. Nevertheless, the agent refused to sell him one. When the blind man insisted on his right to pay full fare, and when he refused to leave the counter until such a ticket was issued, personnel at the Trailways bus station called the police and had him arrested. The language used by the police and their behavior at the depot is reminiscent of ugly confrontations in the black civil rights movement. Last March, a blind man in Washington State bought a train ticket to ride on an Amtrak train. After boarding, he tried to ascend the stairs to the upper level of the observation car. The conductor told him that blind people were not permitted on the upper level. Amtrak, just like Trailways, sells tickets to the handicapped at a reduced rate. Last spring, I received a letter from a woman in Rochester, Indiana, which is all too typical. It describes in miniature the problem. The writer's mother is blind. Inadequate training, segregation, and lack of opportunity are the result. The life portrayed in this letter is dismal. Here is what it says. Dear Sir, my mother has been legally blind for about 20 years. During all that time, she has been in a nursing home in Rochester, Indiana, and she is only 43 years old. She has not in all that time had any training that the blind need, such as how to read Braille. The nursing home has been her only world because of her inability to get around. I feel my mother desperately needs help. She needs to be taught the things the blind need to function in society. She is much too young to be in a nursing home. I wonder if the National Federation of the Blind can help in this matter. I don't have money or the know-how to assist her, and I was told maybe you could help. She's wanting to get out of the nursing home. Sincerely yours. 20 years of a person's life is a long time, and for this woman and many others like her, those 20 years are a bleak memory of twisted hell, of desolation, pain, and lack of opportunity. We in the National Federation of the Blind are organized to make it absolutely certain that blind men and women have something better to do with their lives than go into nursing homes in their 20s. I wonder whether the bonds of steel and leather associated with captives and slaves caused more desolation in the lives of those who endured them than has been felt as a result of the kindness in the nursing home. What should we do to promote a more realistic approach? I do not recommend that all charity come to an end, nor do I recommend that the blind stop accepting all gifts. Instead, I urge all of us to try to understand the nature of what we do. For all human beings everywhere, there are times that demand charity. However, there also comes a time when responsibility must be accepted. Full participation in society will produce more and cost less than dependence upon charity. If we as a culture systematically refuse to permit a group of people to reach its potential, then we have set the stage for conflict. Such behavior creates an inferior class. When the group that is regarded as inferior discovers the two-class system is a lie, it will insist upon its rights. When this happens, there will be confrontation. The blind of this nation, organized in the National Federation of the Blind, are committed to achieving equality and first-class citizenship. We regret that there is apparently a certain amount of conflict built into the transition from second to first-class status. But we know that blind individuals, blind people as a group, our entire society will benefit if the worth that we represent is recognized and given its proper place. We are appreciative of the kind words, the good wishes, and the donations of those who have joined us to ensure that our struggle for freedom comes to fruition. But we are also committed to ending forever the philosophy which says that the proper role for a blind person is as a recipient of someone else's charity. The proper role for the blind is the same as it is for the sighted. There should be charity given and received on both sides. There should also be responsibility. Thank you.
Clay McDowell, our next speaker, is currently a student at the Kennedy School. His previous education includes a BS degree from Fairfield University and an MA from Arizona State University. Prior to attending Kennedy School, he was executive director of the Alaska Mental Health Association. From 1983 through 1985, he was program director of Access Alaska, the state's first independent living center for disabled individuals. He also was rural outreach programs advisor at the University of Alaska in Juneau. He has an extensive background in project design and program management in human services. Clay?
I'd like to address my fellow students here. This is the school where the future administrators and future policymakers are learning their trade. And the focus I'd like to present is one that says that these are the issues that you're going to be dealing with in your positions when you leave here. I've had a great class with Robert Reich this semester, and he has divided people who work on policy issues into policy advocates and policy entrepreneurs. I've always enjoyed policy entrepreneurship myself. It's very exciting, it's very flexible, And it's basically belongs to those who choose to work to change systems from the outside rather than the inside. And so those of you who are interested in this role may look to the various nonprofits that come here to recruit, and you may want to do some outreach on your own. I'm going to share some ways, some experiences and ways that that you can address disability issues. When I got involved with this, I also ran into people in nursing homes in Alaska who had been in nursing homes for a very long time. I have a friend who's now about 24. He was moved into a nursing home when he was 13 as a result of a motorcycle accident. Other people who are involved in our program spent 25, 30, 35 years in a nursing home before any program came along that could open doors to help them find the way out. Now, we're talking the 1980s. We're not talking 2 decades ago or 10 years ago. We're talking 5 years ago, and that's the ones that I know about. I'm not clear what's going on in other parts of the country, but I'd wager that if you visited nursing homes in your home state or your hometown, you may find the same conditions in existence still today. So when I came here, and since I've been here, I've noticed that we focus a lot in the school on the economics of public policy and efficient and effective delivery of services. And we mention the word equity often, but we don't do a lot of case studies on equity. I think it's important that as you spend your time here in school, that you realize that the economic perspective isn't the only perspective that you will confront when you leave here. And in fact, if you let that rule your decision making, then maybe you're not doing the kinds of service to society that you really started out thinking you would do when you first came to the School of Public Policy. Another point I want to make is that independent living and deinstitutionalization and access are not economically bad news. It took us a long time to get the Independent Living Center off the ground in Alaska. But one of our strengths was that we could point to ways that we were able to reduce costs of service to the state by getting people out of institutions, and we were able to cut costs significantly the first year, not 50%, but maybe 10 or 15%, related to what they were paying to keep people in institutions. And that's because your first year you're doing a lot of transitional type work. As years went by, the effectiveness, the cost effectiveness of the programs more and more proved itself. Those of you who are going to be in fields where cost effectiveness is important and dealing with disabilities becomes important to you also may want to look at facts and figures from departments of vocational rehabilitation and from independent living centers on what they've been able to do in terms of improving effectiveness and efficiency of delivery of services. Another point that Ted touched on, and that I'd also like to touch on, is that on the people side of things, when you get involved in this, you find out that there are more people than you ever imagined who've been touched by disability issues. It's astonishing how many people you run into during the course of a day or a course of a week who've experienced some disability with loved ones or friends or family or acquaintances at work, people they care about. So the advocacy group is a lot larger than you may assume. And you can, when you're out there in the policy world, you can tap into this and get a lot of, if not active support, a lot of tacit support, and there are a lot of times when that comes in very, very handy. one of the most effective things that we did to get our program off the ground was try to bring all the various groups together in Alaska that were dealing with disability issues. And we focused on, as you've mentioned, commonalities rather than differences. And what are the commonalities that everybody faced? Well, everybody was trying to gain some sort of housing. Everybody was interested in transportation issues. Everybody was interested in employment and training. These are the sorts of basic grassroots issues that are still truly, truly central to the movement. There's a lot of separation in the movement, as has been mentioned. The particular kind of disability that a person experiences with their family or with themselves tends to become the focus of your energy, and so you can lose track of the commonalities. But when you get out there, try to pull those common interests together. Once we got past the point of everybody fearing for their own special interests and were able to form this kind of common cause, then we became very effective in the political arena. We were able to invite candidates to present their positions, and we would have hundreds of people attending these local legislative or city council or state senate campaign meetings. And they were amazed. They'd walk in and there'd be like 100 or 200 people who were concerned about disability issues and wanted to hear what this district candidate had to say about them. And it generated a momentum that lasted for years. And we got things we never thought we were going to get for year after year through the legislature. So by banding together and by taking on the politics in a positive way, you can cause some significant advancement. I don't have much more to add. I would like to be open to questions on the hows of how we were able to do things. But I would say that another thing is that individuals do have an impact and make a difference. When I see somebody parking in a zone that's set aside for a person with a disability, I habitually would park right behind them, and I'd go call a cop and tell them that the people were parked in a prohibited zone. And I've taken a lot of flack for that, but I still do it. I've got a great story about a friend in Alaska who experiences a disability, a young woman. And she pulled up to the grocery store to do her shopping. Somebody was parked in the quote handicap zone. She had parked elsewhere, and the woman came out and said, "Oh, I'll be out of here in a second." And she had locked herself out of her car, and my friend rolled her chair up and said, "Well, I'll help you get in," and broke into the car for her so she could move the car. And this woman was standing there red-faced for about 10 minutes with this young woman in the chair helping her get into her car so she could move it out of the handicapped parking area. But at any rate, what I'm saying is that everything, you can take actions, even if you don't want to get involved in that direction. There are things that you can do. You can leave a note on somebody. If you see somebody parked there without a sticker, leave a note on their car and say, "This is a reserved spot." Or there are many ways you can get involved. I think I'll let it go, and you can ask me questions if you choose to.
Our last speaker, Joseph Room, is a graduate of the John F. Kennedy School of Government and Public Administration. He's currently the Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Planning for the newly established Mass Department of Mental Retardation. In 1972, he was named to the Colorado Commission on Children and Youth and was instrumental in establishing the Colorado Governor's Blue Ribbon Task Force for the Disabled. In 1980, he was a political consultant and producer for KMGH, CBS Denver, in coverage of the presidential conventions and campaigns. A year later, he moved to Anchorage, Alaska to become the city's Handicapped Services Coordinator. Under his management, a system of services to and for citizens with disabilities was initiated, which remains a model for the nation. He has also held responsibilities working with the elderly, low and moderate income citizens, people with addictions, domestic violence victims, and the homeless. Joe?
Well, thank you for coming. It's lovely to be here at the Kennedy School. One more time, I still owe them money. So, I think it's real important that we're all here tonight because we have something to celebrate that's directly related to disabilities. And that's that in spite of his rhetoric, our president signed an arms negotiation treaty that may prevent disabilities, because that's ultimately what nuclear war is about, is disabilities. And so I think we all deserve a round of applause for ourselves, and maybe a round of applause of hope that this is a first step at eliminating what is the ultimate disability. Huh? Now, in the time it took me to say that in the world, okay, 100 babies were born. 18 of those 100 children are going to have disabilities. So the fact of the matter is that, we're here speaking to the chorus. If you people didn't care about people with disabilities, you wouldn't be here in the first place, so sort of why are we lecturing, It's kind of like, well, okay, so how can we find a common ground? And the fact is that we're in a growth industry. That's the truth. Our environment, the way that we treat one another, the kinds of things that we introduce into our systems, the way that we ignore the realities of alcohol and pregnancy, the way that we ignore the realities of what we're doing to our environment means that more and more children with disabilities are being born. Now, on the other end of that, technology has advanced to the place where children who were born even 5 years ago and who only lived a matter of weeks can now expect to live to see 60 years old. Now, I was struck because the last time that I followed Ted Kennedy anywhere, it was down a hill at Winter Park, Colorado. He was moving much faster than I was, and he came in first, and I came in last, and I'm saying, my God, things replicate themselves, don't they? I have to bat cleanup after Kennedy again. And part of my delight is that Ted, earlier this summer, with some of the Kennedy family, participated in the first time ever that network television depicted people with mental retardation in a way that talked about dignity and appropriate kinds of behavior and activity and enjoyment and happiness and friendship and socialization. It was Special Olympics. And here came Ted leading the delegation, limping like his leg didn't fit very well, but smiling all the while. And I said, I know the feeling. And it's that kind of portrayal of people with disabilities where we stop being sort of the disease of the week. Okay? Have you seen the movies Disease of the Week? Huh? Where, yeah, on Monday night we have them, every once in a while you get them, and it's where these people, like, they lose a limb, or they lose their sight, or they lose their hearing, or they lose their checkbook, and they go out and overcome this tremendous issue in their lives and end up being angels. Well, there are people in this room who can tell you that those of us with disabilities are not exactly angels, aren't there? Okay? And the fact is that we're portrayed as being something a little bigger than life. Well, part of my delight in this arms negotiation is that Coca-Cola, one more time, has really hit the mark. How many of you have seen the advertisement for Coca-Cola that has to do with the arms deal? Well, there's a child sitting at a table in what looks like the Hall of Congress, where I hope at least 2 of these people at this table will sit one day. And she says, I am the hope of the world. I am the future. And then other children file in behind her, and they sing this song, and you see kids of every size and color and shape, and not a single one of them is disabled. But the fact of the matter is that of every one of those 100 children, 18 of them will be. And what we need to do is think about how public policy can make the quality of life for those 18 people better than it's ever been before. people with mental retardation are perhaps the least visible in terms of this debate. And that's because they're not asked to participate. There are very few people who are assistant commissioners for departments that happen to be mentally retarded. But there are articulate people with mental retardation who are going around and presenting their own cases and talking about themselves and participating in choices about their lives. There are people who are moving out of institutions and into communities and becoming your neighbors. You might have read in the Boston Globe, or my favorite paper, the Boston Herald, the recent trials and tribulations faced by a Little League team in Brockton, Massachusetts. Okay? Here were a bunch of kids, okay, sort of like this panel. If you can picture this panel in baseball jerseys, okay? Except there were girls, okay? A couple of girls on the team, and there are women on our team, by the way. This team was being disenfranchised by the Little League Corporation of America. They said, well, you guys are an insurance risk. Worse yet, you need skilled coaches. Well, God forbid. You know who their coaches were? Their parents. Oh, no, I mean to tell you. Who knows less about the needs of a child with a disability than their parents, right? And let's talk about insurance risks. What more could happen to these kids, right? So the people of Massachusetts, Senator John Kerry, some other people got behind this and said, geez, this is terrible. What's happening? But, Little League, that's the all-American sport. We should all be able to play baseball. And they had film clips of the team. Now, again, picture us, okay? None of us run terribly fast. Mark, however, he's great at sliding into third. But here's the team, and they were playing, and they were having a good time. And you'd see this on television, and then you'd think, well, what's wrong with Little League? The Little League said, gee, this is, okay, fine, we'll back off, and instead we'll make this the model for the nation. We lost that battle, in spite of the fact that the Herald said, we won, we won. We lost that battle. We lost that battle because we still have a segregated team. It's not a model for the nation. It's a model for the nation for 1945. I guess what I'm here to talk about is the fact that the issue boils down to three things for me, and maybe for you. Family. Jobs, housing, healthcare, transportation. That's all necessary. But the fact of the matter is, the bottom line is that the interventions that we provide as people in the public sector and in the private sector have to support people and their families. People with disabilities have parents who have the highest divorce rate of any parents in the United States. People with disabilities that happen later on in life have the highest divorce rate of anybody in the United States. People with disabilities have the incidence of alcoholism more often in their families than any other group in the United States. And people with disabilities themselves tend to be alcoholics and substance abusers. I myself am a recovering alcoholic, 4 years sober next week. And it's because of my family that I'm sober. And it's because of my family that I'm here, and it's because of our families that we're here tonight. And so the interventions have to be family-oriented. They have to be family-supported. The second thing is that no matter what progress we make, whether it be in having quality television that shows us for being the kinds of people that we really are, or whether it's civil rights legislation, it all goes down the toilet on Labor Day weekend. When people drive up and put their dimes and their nickels in the bucket and say, I'm buying off Jerry's kids, I'm getting rid of my guilt, it all goes down the toilet. Every time that we see Ted Kennedy demonstrated as a dignified human being ceases to happen when he becomes an object on that weekend. And the third thing ends up being a question that I would like to kind of close with tonight. And it's a question that I ask myself every morning before I go to work. And it's this. You know, at the Kennedy School, they do an interesting thing. It's called a case study, okay? You get a packet of paper that's about 4.5 inches thick, weighs 12 pounds. They give it to you at 9 o'clock in the morning, say, have it read by 12, have all your notes and your ideas of what it's going to do. And it's sort of like telling half the story, okay? They prepare this, you know, so-and-so drives down the road, they get out of their car, they open the door, they step out of the door, a car comes racing by at 75 miles an hour and screech, it stops, you know, and that's where the story stops, and you're supposed to be prepared to go on. So each morning I kind of think to myself of a case. I say, okay, Joseph Room, leaving aside the question of abortion, because we know we're in Massachusetts and there are a lot of Catholics, and I'm one, or used to be. I'm a recovering Catholic, too. So. Leaving aside the issue of abortion, leaving aside the fact that I'm not yet married, let's assume that I was going to have a child. And let's assume, that is, that I was interested in having a child, and let's assume that I went to visit the genetic checking zone, right? You know, where you go and you say, okay, hey, have the genes checked. And they were to say to you, Mr. Room, the child that you will have is going to have a disability. The child that you have, at least for the job that I'm doing right now, is going to have Down syndrome. Now, my job is to make sure that that system out there works for people with Down syndrome. So I've got to answer the question, do I want to have that child?
Well, I've kind of heard a number of viewpoints, several points of view tonight. I seem to hear that we have to be identified as a minority, and yet, if we're identified as a minority, that means that we have to rely on charity. If we rely on charity, it means we have to sell our birthright. If we sell our birthright, it means that we can't get the kind of equality that we want, and there's a problem there. I don't know how to get from A to Z. Each of you has a viewpoint. Given the fact that 2/3 of the disabled population in this country is neither working nor looking for work, that we have these special programs that serve with funds that are $1 and $12 in this country, what areas would each of you target as far as areas where there should be the greatest policy change? In areas of education, in areas of transportation, in areas of supplemental aid programs, and employment programs, in independent living programs, or in mass media public relations programs? And I open it up to the panel. Joe?
I'd like to start by saying that the first place that we ought to open it up is defense programs. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 covers all federal monies except for defense contracts. Okay, so the defense contractor doesn't have a responsibility to make his or her building accessible or to provide jobs for people with disabilities. Now, in Massachusetts alone last year, $7 billion in defense contracts happened. And that meant that part of the miracle of Massachusetts was that $7 billion. Not one job that was covered by Section 504 was created by that public investment. And that might be a place to start.
I think there are a number of different places. I can't give you one answer. But I would say this, that there's more than enough money in $1 trillion to begin to free people in this country. How many know in this room what independent living centers do? I think Clay mentioned it just briefly, but do you really know what they do? A few of you do. Just a look. Well, basically what an IL center is a place, it's a resource center. It's not a place to live. It's an advocacy and resource center, and some training is provided to assist people with severe disabilities to learn how to live independently as possible and to get back into the community. Nationally, we spend $27 million. I didn't say billion. I said $1 million on that program. That's one F-15. Now, I ask you, where are our priorities? In fact, I asked the vice president at a meeting last year, I said, could you spare an F-15? You know, we could double our budget in our independent living. He didn't want to answer that. Now, if we could get a B-1, hey, that'd be terrific. But I'm not kidding. Swap one of those the ones that crashed. Give us that one, and we'll take the money and we'll do incredible things. The IL centers last year served 40-some thousand people with that $27 million, and we improve the quality of life of all of those people. I would also say, however, that just as importantly, vocational rehabilitation is important, because once people become more independent and begin to realize they can control their lives, they want to go to work. Nobody, for the most part, wants to be dependent completely on society. So we spend $1 billion nationwide in vocational rehabilitation. $1 billion. Now that's a lot of money, but it's still only 1/1000th of the total national budget. And I'd also say that in terms of transportation, what it costs to make a bus accessible is minuscule if you amortize the cost of that bus over the useful life. And some of the buses in Boston have been around since before they had horse-drawn carts. So I mean, the cost has long since been overpaid for. So the point I'm making is that I don't think it's a matter of cost. I think the comment that was made early on, I think it's by Clay, about your issues of the bottom line. I wrote down a note. The bottom line is not the bottom line. The real issue is here, you cannot equate costs for civil rights and equality in dollars.
Mr. Chairman, I can't say that I disagree with that which has been said, but it seems to me that the emphasis is wrong. And it seems to me that that is the case for this reason. What we've been talking about here, at least in part, and in fairly substantial part, is a way to get a program which is part of the government or associated with the government or something or another, which will help to provide more equality to the handicapped. Now that implies two things which I think are not true. One of them is that there is such a thing as the handicapped. I don't believe there is. There are a great many people involved in what is known as the handicapped, and it is very often customary or even polite or courteous to assume or pretend that they are the same. But there are interests in those groups which are not the same. And unless we begin by stating what is realistic, we cannot go beyond that. Secondly, the problem of first-class status for any group is a problem which that group must solve. Nobody else can do it. If somebody says to you, I hereby give to you your freedom, that implies that I may take it away, or at least that I control it. It isn't up to anybody else. It has to be up to the group itself. You can't have, for example, the French come to these shores during the time of the Revolutionary War and have the French lick the British and then have the colonies be free. As the French lick the British, then the colonies are still the colonies. There are colonies of a different power, but they're still the colonies. Same is true for groups of disabled human beings. If those human beings are to achieve equality and first-class status, the members of those groups must come to recognize the responsibility for doing so. I understand that those people are not responsible for the pickle that they may be in. I'm not saying that they are. They didn't create the world as it is, or we didn't, since I'm a part of it. But I'm in it now, and if it's to be changed, one of the principal methods for changing it is that I must get myself and those who are willing to stand with me to change it. I can't depend on a government program. The government programs have been around now since 1943, and they've done some good, but they haven't been the primary vehicle for change. The primary vehicle for change has been those human beings who were disabled who said, I have had enough of this, I'm going to go out there and change it, and have been sufficiently stern about it, or some people would say obdurate, and some people would have other less complimentary terms, that change came about and got done. It didn't happen, for example, back in 1943 we had this new Rehabilitation Act which was adopted, and everybody was supposed to be rehabilitated. The federal government, of course, had a policy which said that no blind person could apply for the civil service. Well, we don't have that problem anymore, but the reason that we don't have it is that a bunch of blind people got together and said, this has got to stop, and made it sufficiently publicly known and brought it to the attention of certain members of the Congress that it did get changed. One of the things that happened in those years, in the 50s, as a matter of fact, was that Senator Kennedy introduced a bill to make it proper for the disabled to have the right to organize, which a number of people had said they shouldn't be able to do. But all of that is to say that our emphasis needs to be not on providing more government money for more government programs. Surely we can change the government programs and make them better. Surely we can spend more money on it. That'll help. But it isn't the principal thing that needs to be done in order to effect change. Change has to come from the people who are affected. Now, and their friends. I'm not saying that they're the only people involved. All of us, of course, would want to get as many friends as we can so that we can help make it happen faster. But if, as is so very often the case for people who are blind, if you have an agency for the blind over here which decides what it is that's good for the blind and what blind people ought to have and do and be, then you've got the same problem except it's compounded. Because when the public at large looks at the problems of blindness, they look to the government agency, and if the government agency isn't doing what it ought to do, then the blind people who need to get change accomplished need to kick the people who are running the government program out of the way in order to get to the public. So it seems to me that the emphasis is wrong. We've got to, and I don't think it's a simple problem, and I don't think it is easy. We've got to get to the people who are affected and instill a spirit of independence in that crowd and make that crowd say, we are going to go out there and make sure that there is no discrimination, and if you don't like it, we'll be glad to sit in front of your buses downtown or whatever it is until it's gone. It seems to me that has to be the focus. Otherwise, we simply impose another layer of bureaucracy on a situation which is not now good.
Can I comment on that? I think a lot of the points you made were very well taken, especially in terms of the fact that we need to work together as a group. But, there was, over here we talked about leadership, which I think is very important, and I would contend that, how many people are on the boards of transportation boards? How many women are on the boards of major corporations in this country? We face the same things. But I think you're off the track in some respect because, in a sense, society is the group that's created the problem, and I think it has to be a part of the solution as well. No one on this board, on this panel here, is advocating more money. We don't want charity. That's the last thing we want. We want equal justice, and I think that that's one of the things that needs really to be said. I agree with many of the things that you had to say, but I disagree in the sense where we have policies in this country that serve to perpetuate our problems, and I think it's up to us to speak out. But at the same point, I think that it's not more money, and I think those policy analysts here can understand. Anybody that's been involved in this understands that if you provide, not even provide, I don't like that term, because what you're trying to do is dismantle a system. Our system that we have is a form of apartheid here in this country. And just as the same way that we have to end our form of apartheid here, I believe that a solution exists that everybody can take part in. And I think that, so I think it's not quite as clear as you say, because I'm not for spending more federal dollars. But, you know, when my taxpayers' money is being used to subsidize an transportation system which is not public in Boston, and 5 out of every $6 spent by the MBTA is not the 60 cents you pay in your tolls, but comes from taxpayers' money. And I reject my taxpayers' money being used to build separate schools. And surely the people, other people, have a role in this. And as I tried to mention in my speech, it's not something that just affects our community. It affects everybody in this room. And I agree that it takes sometimes to chain yourself to in an accessible bus to get somebody's attention. Our issues are like that. We need to hit somebody over the head to listen to us. And I think I agree with a lot of what you say, but I think it's much more in terms of equal justice.
You have chastened me, and let me just add a thing. I feel chastened, and justly so. For in saying one of the things I said that we shouldn't lie about what we're really after, and then I went ahead and lied. So let me tell you what the lie was. I said that I thought maybe we ought to spend more money, which is a thing I really don't believe. I don't believe that, and I don't know whether other people here do or not. But there's so much money being spent now, which I regard as being wasted, that I think if we spend a lot more money, we'll just waste more. So if we could quit wasting it and start spending it right, then I think it might be useful, but I'm certainly not willing to put more money into the hands of the people who have been spending it to try to make part of the problem instead of part of the solution. I'll tell you that. So let me start with that part.
Joe first, then John.
Well, I'd just like to be the lone man out here and say, yes, we need more money.
There's going to be two of us going to say
And the fact of the matter is that it's not a question of cutting defense spending to spend more money on people with disabilities. I mean, we're at a completely different time in the history of our humanity. I mean, the children, like I say, 18 of every 100 children. Okay? Now, from the time that we started to sit down here, that's roughly 3,000 children in the world that have disabilities. Okay? It's going to take more money. It's going to take more resources. And it's going to take, I mean, when we talked about leadership and when Ted talked about what we represent and why we were hidden away, I mean, if we step back and look at that, we as people with disabilities represent humanity. We represent the fact that we're all going to die someday. And I disagree with Ted when he says that we're a minority. The fact of the matter is that each and every one of you who considers yourself able-bodied is only that way for a while. We're all going to be disabled eventually. And so it just serves to invest in an accessible and an affordable and a humane, family-oriented system, be it government funds or private funds.
Clay?
Well, Joe hit it on the head there. It seems as if what we're addressing here again is separation, and what we're trying to get across is that there really isn't any separation. We have an aging population in the United States, a maturing population. If you put in a ramp rather than a set of stairs, take a count sometime and see who uses the stairs and who uses the ramp. I mean, everybody uses the ramp. Accessible elevators. I see people taking elevators here. I wonder why they take elevators all the time. You see everybody taking the elevator here. The issue of accessibility is an issue that impacts our entire social fabric and will do more so over the future. It's good public policy and good policy planning to prepare for an aging population in this country.
I had to respond. Not because I'm now one of those agency bureaucrats who who wants to increase their budget, because my background is community organizing. And if anybody believes in organizing people, I do. I've spent the last 15 years of my life organizing, driving the back roads of Virginia and telling people with disabilities they can make a difference. But I also tell you it takes resources to help people become empowered. We need money in independent living, for instance, to help people in nursing homes learn they can make a difference in their lives. And in fact, what IL does is put the money in hands of the people you're talking about. It gives people with disabilities control over their own lives, because not only do they manage the programs, they're the majority on the boards, they're the people who staff and run the centers. And they ultimately do pay taxes when they go back to work. So I'm not going to sit there and advocate and try to fool you that it isn't going to take more money. And I'm not sure I agree about the defense budget. I mean, I worked for the federal government in the Defense Department for 15 years. And I could discuss that the rest of the night, too. I think there's more than enough money out there in that budget to give disabled people a fair share to make our lives more meaningful. And that's what I think the bottom line is, and not the bottom line of the budget. Thank you.
Okay. At this point, we've just hit our 9:30 mark. I'd like to solicit several questions from the audience, if there are any.
I wanted to sort of bring it back to Harvard, because that's where we are right now. I know that as a Harvard freshman, I started out my time here as a disabled student being told by a professor that he certainly was not going to have a cripple in his class. And I did what a lot of students here have had to do, which is bang on a lot of doors. And unfortunately, one of the reassuring words that I got was that Harvard has a proud tradition of meeting the needs of students with disabilities. And an illustration of that was that Helen Keller had gone to Harvard. I thought about that for a little bit and asked around and learned that when Helen Keller went to school, it was under the condition that she didn't attend classes. So the message was real clear. And in my eyes, the tradition here is far from a proud one. And I guess I'm raising the concern because I'd like to know what the panel thinks about what the special responsibilities are of an educational institution, and what the role of students are and people with concerns in encouraging that institution to meet those needs.
I'm sure all of us can probably answer that. But I think Harvard has a special role to play in all of this. It's really not these bastions of so-called liberal thought, one of whom that we're in tonight, that purports to bring in people from all different backgrounds, all different ethnic and financial backgrounds together, so everyone can learn from one another. It's possible in our country to go from first grade and graduate from college never having ever met somebody with a disability. And I think Harvard has a special responsibility, being in the forefront of progressive thought, to make sure that their facilities are accessible. I've heard some similar horror stories. Perhaps somebody else here can comment as well.
I'd just like to say, as an alumni of the Kennedy School, that I think it's a real special message that the Kennedy School of Government is the first place to host this kind of activity. And I think it speaks about the principle of leadership that the public sector represents to the rest of society. And I think that when you look at In Search for Excellence, when you look at those kinds of things, what they're teaching there is the public sector management principle. And that's what the Kennedy School is about. And I think that the Kennedy School deserves, and its dean deserves, a round of acknowledgement for their commitment to accessing. I mean, this is the only graduate school of any of the graduate schools that has the kind of accessibility that it does. I mean, it's not the greatest. Well, it's not that, right? And as soon as it gets childcare, it might even come into the 20th century.
Wait. Mark? Oh. Mark, did you have something to say?
No, sir.
Okay.
Nice of you to call on me, though.
Thank you.
I was just going to say I'm not from Boston. Could you tell? I have a slight twang in my speaking voice. I'm from the South, and ever since I can remember, I've thought of Boston, Massachusetts, and Harvard, as Teddy said, as the bastion of liberal thinking. And to hear somebody tell me that a professor called you crippled, first of all, and then to say that you could not even be allowed in his class, it makes me sick. I mean, I can't even imagine that, and I'm not going to judge. Please don't misunderstand me. But I think if even one person, that happens to one person in a special place like Harvard, which I think truly does represent the ideals of what this country is about in terms of promoting access and equality in education. We've got some work to do.
You have stimulated me now, so I have something.
Well, I'm just glad I did that.
You're a very stimulating person. I'll tell you this. On the subject of a person being kept out of a class, at least as far as blindness is concerned, which is the subject I deal with, and one of the things that is something of a concern to me is that here I am talking about the handicapped here in this panel. I don't know a lot about the handicapped. I know a great deal about the blind, but not a lot about the handicapped. I know something about some disabilities that I've helped to meet or deal with, but I don't feel that I have the capacity to speak for the handicapped. I do have the capacity to speak for the blind, and I do for a very simple reason. I was elected by blind people to do so. Now, about blindness, if there is a blind person who faces a situation such as you have described, we will be glad to help out, and Harvard will be glad to take that person by and by, and you can count on it. We know how to do it. So I hope there are other disability groups of the same mind. We, as a matter of fact, have decided that the charity is sufficient, that we intend to have a piece of the action, and that's what I've been talking about here. So if you find a blind person who has that kind of trouble, you just let me know, and Harvard and I will talk it over, and by that person will be in class.
I want to thank each of our panelists this evening for their insightful comments and their views relating to these important issues. We invite you to join us in our efforts to be proponents of the Project Inclusion concept here at the university. If you'd like to become a member of Project Inclusion, please see me after our formal program. In fact, all of you are welcome to come to a reception in honor of our speakers in the Institute of Politics living room, which is located directly to the left of the main entrance, and that is right now. I want to thank you for coming, and again, thanks to our panelists.
I think we also owe a round of applause to our interpreter, who's had to work all night long.